Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We're here again to journey through some fascinating source material, getting right to the core insights.
That's right.
And today, well, we're tackling a subject you probably think you know inside out, the American Revolution. But honestly, using these incredibly detailed scholarly sources you've provided us with, we're going to uncover a revolution that's, well, far more complex. It's messier and, frankly, more surprising than the version you usually get.
Absolutely. And that's really our mission here, isn't it? Drawing straight from these academic texts, pushing past those familiar, maybe overly simple narratives.
Exactly.
We want to explore the really dense social, economic, political undercurrents that, truly shape this whole foundational period. Think of it as a chance to really engage with the kind of deep professional analysis these sources make possible.
Couldn't have put it better. These aren't just summaries. They're really rich, detailed works, and they bring out some, well, incredibly insightful and sometimes, let's be honest, uncomfortable truths that often get smoothed over.
They do.
So we're going to dig in professionally, really see what all this detail tells us.
Okay, so where do we start? Maybe the very beginnings, the early friction points.
Good idea. Because it wasn't just, philosophical debates right out of the gate. These sources really hammer home how concrete issues, especially land, created some fundamental conflicts very early on.
Yeah, the land issue is huge. It's striking how central land speculation is presented here, almost a primary driver, even before the big tax fights we always hear about.
You see it so clearly in the late 1760s. I mean, the British actions were almost contradictory, weren't they?
It's quite something, that detail from 1768. You've got Sir William Johnson, right, negotiating with the Iroquois, and they agree to sell this huge amount of land in the Ohio Valley, and Britain's like, great. Ours now.
But then almost at the same time, you've got John Stuart down south meeting with the Cherokee, the Treaty of Hard Labor.
Exactly. And he's following his orders from London, which are to respect Cherokee claims and leave that very same Ohio Valley region under their control.
So wait, Britain buys land from the Iroquois.
Yep.
And simultaneously promises the Cherokee that it's their territory and will be left alone.
That's what the sources indicate. You can just imagine the chaos that unleashed for colonists who were itching to move west.
Oh, absolutely. And Virginia's reaction, it just lays bare who stood to gain, who was really pushing things.
It really does.
Yeah.
Because that hard labor agreement, it meant Virginia suddenly had to void all these land plats already drawn up for the Loyal Company.
A major Virginia speculation firm.
A huge one. But the sources, they showed the Virginia Executive Council, the House of Burgesses, they were deeply personally invested in these schemes.
Right. You've got Washington, Patrick Henry, Jefferson, Richard Henry Lee, the big names.
All of them, sitting on the council or in the Burgesses. And they vote, unanimously, mind you, to petition the governor for permission to occupy Kentucky anyway, despite the treaty with the Cherokee.
So much for abstract liberty driving that particular petition.
It was about the cold, hard economic interest of those land speculators.
And this link, between economic self-interest and political action. It wasn't just land, was it? These sources make a pretty compelling case that the slave trade itself was a massive point of contention with Britain. Maybe more than we usually acknowledge.
They certainly frame it that way. It's interesting that Virginia's own royal governor, Lord Dunmore, apparently opposed the slave trade.
Really?
Yeah, and he even predicted, quite accurately it turns out, that if war broke out, an invader could easily conquer Virginia just by allying with the enslaved population.
Wow. But despite people like Dunmore having concerns, Britain seemed determined to keep the trade going.
Well, the sources state that imperial officials in 8 of the 13 colonies actively overturned colonial laws that were trying to limit the slave trade. It wasn't just passive acceptance. It reads like active prioritization of trader profits over colonial wishes.
You see that reflected in Jefferson's summary view.
Right.
His complaint about Britain prioritizing, the immediate advantages of a few African corsairs.
That's the one. Over American welfare. And George Mason, even more bluntly, called Britain's support for the slave traders one of the great causes of our separation.
That's a powerful claim, putting it right up there with taxes and representation.
It suggests it was, for some key figures anyway, absolutely central.
Which then brings up the question of the enslaved people themselves. Their actions, like escaping, must have played a significant role.
A huge role. You get this sense of a three-way struggle. The Whigs, the British, and the fugitive slaves, each maneuvering for their own advantage. It really intensified things, particularly in Virginia.
Like the escapes to British ships. Off Sullivan's Island, for instance.
Exactly. That was
Yeah.
common. And Dunmore's plan, even though it didn't fully materialize, his idea to raise black soldiers shows the British definitely recognized the strategic potential there. And you had incidents like the Battle of Great Bridge, Leslie's rather imprudent frontal assault.
Right.
It all ties in.
And the sources show how this whole dynamic shifted during the war, too.
Yeah, later on, Southern Whigs, desperate for troops, started using enslaved people as enlistment bounties, handing them over to white soldiers who signed up.
Which is such a stark contrast to someone like John Lawrence, right, who was pushing hard to actually enlist black men into the Continental Army.
A complete contrast. And there's this really tragic story the sources detail where these dynamics collide. South Carolina Whigs started raiding Loyalist plantations specifically to capture people to use as bounties.
Okay.
And those raids disrupted agriculture so much that it wrecked an informal deal where the British Army had actually been buying food from Whig farmers in the area.
So the bounty raids cut off the British food supply.
Pretty much. Which forced the British into more aggressive foraging raids to find supplies.
And Lawrence?
John Lawrence, the advocate for black enlistment, was killed during one of those very foraging raids in 1782.
Wow. It just shows how the economics of slavery, the military needs, individual lives, it was all tangled together in these really devastating ways.
Absolutely devastating.
Okay, let's maybe shift gears a bit. The sources also give us a real ground-level look at the military side of things, right?
Yeah.
The challenges, the strategies, often more complex than the standard battle summaries.
Definitely. Take the Quebec invasion, for example. We often hear about it as this bold failure, but the sources really detail just how incredibly difficult it was right from the start.
Arnold's force was small, wasn't it?
Undersized, facing brutal terrain that promontory climb, and he had to wait for Montgomery's forces to even join him.
And the defenders.
A mix. British regulars, crucial native allies, Canadian militia, and they often outnumbered the Americans, sometimes by as much as 2-1.
And then there was disease.
A terrible smallpox outbreak swept through the American camp. Add that to Governor Carleton's absolute refusal to surrender or even, receive a messenger. You just see the mountain they were trying to climb.
Yeah, insurmountable odds, really. What about Long Island? That's another key early battle.
The sources really highlight Howe's tactical success there. That flanking maneuver through Jamaica Pass, classic hammer and anvil, it just shredded the American militia.
You can almost feel the panic in the accounts.
Oh, yeah. Survivors described the sheer terror of suddenly taking fire from the flank, from the rear. Total surprise.
But then something unexpected happened.
Right, this massive storm, a nor'easter, blew in, and it physically prevented Admiral Howe's fleet, his brother's fleet, from sailing up the East River to cut off Washington's only escape route.
Incredible luck. Or providence, depending on your view.
Yeah, Washington didn't hesitate. He grabbed that chance. And the sources make a point of noting who actually did the work of that evacuation from Brooklyn Heights.
The sailors.
Diverse sailors from Essex County, Massachusetts, many of whom, the sources suggest, were likely the very people targeted by Grenville's trade crackdowns a decade earlier.
So the guys hurt by British economic policy were the ones saving the army. That's quite an irony.
It really connects those economic grievances directly to the Army's survival.
And after Long Island, the fighting continued, but the dynamic shifted a bit.
Yeah, you see actions like Pell's Point, where a relatively small American force managed to skillfully delay the British advance, inflict some casualties, buy Washington precious time.
And Washington himself, his strategy, did he learn from Long Island?
It seems so. While the sources note his instinct, like many commanders then, was sometimes for these frontal assaults, think Bunker Hill, even though that was technically a loss, he often adopted a more defensive posture after Long Island. Maybe realizing, that British reinforcements just seem endless. He couldn't afford to just trade casualties endlessly.
His positioning at White Plains seems like an example of that caution, maybe. Setting up west to east, with that vulnerable spot on Chatterton Hill.
Yeah, potentially vulnerable militia on the hill. It was a calculated risk, perhaps, and Howe was notably slow to actually attack it, delaying his advance.
Then came the loss of the forts on the Hudson, Washington and Lee. That wasn't really a battle, was it? More of a collapse.
Largely logistical, according to these accounts. The Americans were desperately trying to move supplies out of Fort Lee as Cornwallis crossed the river.
Traffic jams during a retreat.
Massive traffic problems is the phrase used. It slowed everything down. The British basically swept in, captured stragglers, tons of flour, vital heavy cannon, all without firing a shot. It really highlights how often these major setbacks weren't about being outfought, but about being outmaneuvered or unprepared logistically.
Logistics and strategic decisions seem key, like Howe's choice for the Philadelphia campaign later on. Why didn't he just sail up the Delaware?
Good question. The direct route up the Delaware River was shorter, obviously, but the Americans had defenses there, fire ships and floating batteries, the sources call them. Dangerous stuff.
So Howe decided against forcing the river.
Exactly. He chose the much longer route, sailed south all the way around into Chesapeake Bay.
Added, what, hundreds of miles?
Over 250 water miles. A huge detour. But the key thing was, it guaranteed him an unopposed landing further south. He prioritized getting his army ashore safely over speed, a very deliberate calculation.
Meanwhile, up north, Burgoyne was having his own logistical nightmares heading towards Saratoga.
Oh, absolutely. His march from Scansborough down towards Fort Edward. The rebels didn't necessarily stand and fight him head-on initially. Instead, they waged war on his supply line and movement.
How so?
Systematically destroying bridges, damming up streams to create swamps, felling huge trees across the already terrible roads. Just relentless harassment.
That must have slowed him down immensely.
Well, what's interesting is the sources say the actual march itself, once they got moving after clearing obstacles, only took about 5 days. The real damage wasn't just the delay from clearing the path.
What was it then?
It was the time spent doing that consumed Burgoyne's food supplies at an alarming rate. And even more critically, the rebels systematically removed or destroyed all the forage food for the horses and oxen and the draft animals themselves along the route.
So they crippled his transport.
Exactly. It crippled his ability to move supplies, artillery. It hamstrung his whole army long before the major battles.
And the context around Saratoga, the wider campaign, is also really illuminated by these sources. Fort Stanwix, for instance.
Right. The siege of Fort Stanwix, which the rebels had renamed Fort Schuyler, that situation involved really complex Iroquois alliances. Most nations sided with the British, that's true.
But not all of them.
No. Critically, the Oneidas and the Tuscaroras sided with the rebels.
Why did they break ranks, so to speak?
The sources delve into it. For the Oneidas, it seems influenced by New Light Presbyterian missionaries they trusted, and also a pragmatic calculation that the Whigs were likely to win the war eventually. Siding with them seemed the best bet to preserve their own territory in the long run.
And that alliance mattered.
Hugely. You had Oneida warriors joining Nicholas Herkimer's militia relief column marching to lift the siege. And then there's the story of Mary Brant, Joseph Brant's sister, and Sir William Johnson's widow, warning her brother and the British commander St. Leger about Herkimer's approach.
Which led to the ambush.
Precisely.
Yeah.
It set up the bloody ambush at Oriskany, intricate alliances and intelligence shaping major battles.
Let's talk about Brandywine. A major battle, often seen as a clear British victory, but the sources add some complexity.
They do. There was a lot of confusion on the American side. Apparently, a mistaken report from a major spear about where the British flanking force was actually, inadvertently, saved the American center from being hit too early, bought them some time. And even though Cornwallis's flanking troops were rested and eventually broke through, the American resistance, particularly where Sullivan's division eventually formed, was incredibly fierce. While General Conway, who was there, wrote about experiencing so close and severe a fire. Accounts suggest the Americans actually retook the main hilltop position 5 times in the fighting.
5 times? Yeah, holding out for over an hour and a half under intense pressure before finally having to retreat. So yes, a British victory, but a hard-fought one where the Americans didn't just collapse. And then Washington surprises everyone again at Germantown right after Brandywine.
It was a really bold move, wasn't it? Less than 2 weeks after that defeat. Washington crosses the Schuylkill, which Howe hadn't contested, and launches an offensive.
Why did he think he could get away with it?
The sources suggest he was banking on the element of surprise, exploiting a British assumption that the Americans must be totally dispirited after Brandywine and wouldn't dare attack.
So he tried to repeat the Trenton strategy.
Pretty much. A complicated plan involving multiple columns converging after a long overnight march, aiming for a dawn surprise attack.
And Howe hadn't fortified his position.
No. Apparently, Howe deliberately chose not to build fortifications north of Germantown. The sources suggest he felt it would make his army look weak or inferior if they started digging in. That played right into Washington's plan for his surprise assault.
Fascinating. What about further afield? The South? The West? Cowpens comes to mind.
Ah, cowpens. Daniel Morgan's classic victory. The sources highlight his really interesting, maybe counterintuitive decision to stand and fight there.
Why counterintuitive?
Well, the terrain was flat, open, seemingly perfect for Bannister Tarleton's feared British cavalry, and Morgan put his back to the rain-swollen Broad River, limiting his own retreat options.
Sounds risky. Why do it?
Practical leadership dilemmas. He was stuck. He dreaded trying to get his army across that flooded river with Tarleton breathing down his neck. But crucially, the sources mention many of his South Carolina militia flat out threatened to desert him if he tried to cross the river into North Carolina.
So he had to fight where he stood to keep his army together.
Essentially, yes, it was a calculated risk born out of those immediate pressures. Brilliant tactics followed, of course, but the decision to fight there was shaped by those factors.
And the war had other players too, right? The Spanish.
Definitely. The sources mention Bernardo de Galvez, the Spanish governor of Louisiana. He was actively fighting the British down south. He seized the British fort at Mobile Bay, then went on to capture Pensacola.
Which effectively did what?
Secured West Florida for Spain, took it right out of British hands, a significant contribution.
And of course the French. Indispensable by the end.
Absolutely crucial. Rochambeau's arrival with the French army. The sources detail his meeting with Washington at Wethersfield, Connecticut. And interestingly, they initially disagreed on strategy.
How so?
Rochambeau, perhaps seeing the situation more clearly from a naval perspective, favored a campaign down in Virginia targeting Cornwallis. Washington, though, still seemed fixated on retaking New York City.
What changed Washington's mind? Or Clinton's plans?
Well, British intelligence seems to have played a fascinating role here. According to these sources, Washington, often short on funds for secure couriers, apparently sent some pretty sensitive letters discussing his New York plans through the regular mail.
Seriously?
Right?
Regular mail?
That's what's suggested. And British agents intercepted them. So Sir Henry Clinton, the British commander in New York, learned about Washington's intention to attack him there.
Ah, so Clinton braced for an attack on New York.
Exactly. Which arguably made him less likely to send reinforcements down to Cornwallis and Virginia later on, contributing, perhaps indirectly, to the eventual Franco-American focus shifting south to Yorktown. A tiny detail with potentially huge consequences.
And out west, we hear about George Rogers Clark.
Clark's campaigns were certainly destructive, like burning Shawnee villages, but the sources offer a more nuanced picture. The Shawnees often just rebuilt further north, adapting.
So American success was limited.
Very much so in terms of capturing key British posts. The sources are quite clear that the main reason the Americans repeatedly failed to capture vital hubs like Sandusky or Detroit, which they saw as the heart of the Anglo-Indian alliance and desperately wanted, wasn't just British strength.
What was it then?
Primarily, it was determined effective native resistance. Indigenous nations were defending their lands and interests, and they proved a major obstacle to American expansionist aims throughout the war.
Okay, that covers a lot of the military and diplomatic ground. But these sources also seem to dig deep into the internal stuff, right? Tensions within colonial society. It wasn't just patriot versus loyalist.
Not at all. That's one of the most revealing aspects, I think. You see these really sharp class tensions bubbling up. Take that farmers' revolt in Loudoun County, Virginia, February 1776.
Led by someone who knew Washington.
Yeah, James Cleveland, apparently a former employee of Washington's. He was leading tenant farmers, guys renting land. And their slogans, they cut right to the bone economically.
What were they saying?
Things like, the tenants should pay no rents. A direct hit against the landowners, tied to the economic pain everyone was feeling from the non-exportation agreements, the embargo.
And connecting it to the war effort itself.
Explicitly, there is no inducement for a poor man to fight, for he has nothing to defend. Linking lack of property directly to a lack of motivation to sacrifice for the cause, radical stuff.
He even had opinions on strategy.
Pushed for equal pay between officers and soldiers and urged the leadership to stop being shilly-shally, basically, get on with the fighting, win quickly, before the economic hardship ruined everyone. It shows this real revolutionary energy coming from below, fueled by hardship and a deep resentment of the existing hierarchy.
And it wasn't just tenant farmers. Even loyalists could have complex motives for switching sides.
Right. The sources mention Robert Cunningham. He'd been jailed as a loyalist, but then got released. After experiencing Cherokee attacks on the frontier attacks, he blamed squarely on the imperial government for failing to manage relations. He completely flipped.
He blamed London, not the Patriots.
Yes. He declared he now most heartily desired to take the oath of fidelity to the United Colonies. It shows how local grievances, local experiences, even for someone initially opposed to the cause, could completely change their allegiance. It wasn't always about high principle.
Keeping the army itself together was obviously a constant struggle, too.
Immense struggle. You see Washington practically begging Congress for what they called a douceur, basically a sweetener, a cash bonus, $100.
For soldiers who'd enlist for the whole war.
Exactly, for the duration. And Congress, knowing how desperate the situation was, approved it incredibly quickly, just 13 days.
Did it work?
It was crucial for holding the army together, yes. But the sources add a wrinkle. It also kind of acted as a trap for men who'd originally signed up for shorter terms, like 3 years.
How so?
Well, they took the bonus, they needed the money, but then found themselves legally locked in for the entire war, however long that might be. Maybe longer than they'd bargained for. Created some resentment down the line.
And there were times when troops just resisted orders.
Oh, yes. You had instances like New Jersey militiamen literally blocking the advance of the British General Knyphausen, forcing Washington to pull his main army back into the highly defensible Short Hills position. And then, of course, the really famous Pennsylvania Line Mutiny later in the war. That unit, according to these accounts, was near dissolution. Real moments of crisis.
To really grasp all these internal dynamics, the sources seem to suggest we need to understand the whole social structure of the time.
Exactly. They paint a picture of this traditional monarchical hierarchy, a kind of long train of dependence stretching all the way from the king at the top down through various levels of gentry, farmers, artisans, tenants, indentured servants, and finally enslaved people at the bottom.
Everyone had their place.
Everyone had a proper sphere, as they put it. It was all seen as this interconnected, dependent whole. And the sources suggest that colonists might have been particularly conscious of their legal dependence on England compared to people living in Britain itself, which maybe made the idea of independence resonate more strongly.
And how did slavery fit into that picture initially?
Well, the argument presented here is that, at first, black slavery was often understood by many white colonists as simply the most extreme form of servitude and dependence, existing on a continuum with various forms of white bonded labor like indentured servitude, not necessarily a completely separate category initially.
And relationships were more personal? Less anonymous?
Very much so. Paternalism was a key organizing principle. Social ties, even outside the immediate family, were often framed using kinship analogies, masters acting like fathers, etc. The sources argue it was actually hard to find truly impersonal, market-based relationships in America's smaller towns and rural communities, unlike in, say, the bigger cities of England.
Okay, so within that structure, what about the gentry? The Washingtons, Jeffersons, Franklins, what were their specific pressures?
The ideal for a gentleman was defined by leisure and, crucially, disinterestedness, meaning they were supposed to be wealthy enough from land or investments that they didn't need to work for a living and could therefore serve the public good without personal financial motive. Following that classical Roman principle, Jefferson so admired.
But was that the reality? Especially for planters.
Often, no. Particularly for Virginia planters, the sources emphasize the crushing burden of debt many carried, mostly owed to British merchants and creditors. They were trying desperately to maintain the outward appearance of leisured, disinterested gentlemen,
while being totally tied to commerce and debt.
Exactly. Deeply entangled. And interestingly, the non-importation agreements boycotting British goods served a dual purpose for some. Yes, it was political protest, but it was also a socially acceptable excuse to cut back on buying expensive British luxuries they couldn't really afford without publicly admitting they were in financial trouble.
Clever. Were things different for gentry in the North?
Somewhat different pressures. The sources suggest northern gentlemen often couldn't rely solely on land. When they needed money, they frequently had to retire from public life, not to a country estate, but back to active professions like law to earn income. So this tension, this gap between the ideal of disinterested public service and the practical reality of needing to make money and manage commercial affairs was a constant, deep personal struggle for many of these leading figures.
And those personal struggles, those economic realities, they must connect directly to the evolving political ideas the sources discuss. It sounds like there was a big shift happening in how people even thought about government and society.
Oh, absolutely. A fundamental shift. The sources contrast, older historical interpretations that focus purely on the lofty ideals of the revolution.
The all men are created equal narrative.
Right. With the later progressive historians who came along and tried to explain everything through socioeconomic factors, class struggle, economic determinism, influenced by Marx, Freud, behaviorism, They tended to see the revolutionary ideas as just ideologies, fancy rationalizations for underlying material interests.
But these sources take a more nuanced view.
They do. They acknowledge the importance of historians like Bernard Bailyn, who argued that ideas actually did have their own power, their own autonomy. But Bailyn also showed how the language used by the revolutionaries, all that talk of tyranny, corruption, virtue, liberty, slavery, wasn't just empty rhetoric. It revealed a deep, psychologically true social reality for the people using those words.
Meaning they really felt oppressed.
Yes. Those words had real personal and social significance. The feeling of being oppressed, of living under a corrupt system, was genuine. Even if, as John Adams himself apparently suggested, some of that feeling was maybe displaced onto the imperial system from anxieties closer to home.
What were some of the core intellectual influences shaping their worldview?
A huge one was classical republicanism, sometimes called civic humanism. These were ideas about government and society drawn from ancient Greece and Rome, passed down through the Renaissance.
Ideas like virtue.
Civic virtue, yes. Public service, self-sacrifice for the common good, independence, and especially that ideal of disinterestedness we talked about. The ideal citizen was the independent gentleman farmer, living modestly on his own land, free from the corrupting influence of commerce or dependence on others. Like John Dickinson, a wealthy lawyer posing as a simple farmer in Pennsylvania.
And these classical ideas were widespread.
Very much so among the educated elite, on both sides of the Atlantic, actually. They provided a powerful shared language for critiquing what they saw as the excessive luxury, selfishness, and corruption of the British monarchy and its court system.
But at the same time, weren't commercial interests growing? Wasn't society becoming less like that classical ideal?
Absolutely. And the sources detail this tension. You have the rise of commercialism, a growing acceptance, even celebration of self-interest as a driving force in society.
Where did that come from?
Partly from Enlightenment philosophy. Thinkers like John Locke. His ideas about sensationalism, that we're born as blank slates and our knowledge comes from sensory experience. This led to the radical premise that all men are essentially born equal and are shaped primarily by their environment.
Which had implications beyond just philosophy.
Big ones. It fostered a greater sense of sympathy, humanitarian concern for others shaped by bad environments. But it also, maybe paradoxically, helped justify economic expansion and the pursuit of private interest.
How so?
Well, figures like Benjamin Franklin argued that the desire for consumer goods, the hope of buying luxuries, wasn't necessarily corrupting. He saw it as a powerful spur to labor and industry.
Making people work harder.
Exactly. He observed farmers would work harder if they wanted pleasures and diversions, but would stop working if their pay became useless, if there was nothing appealing to buy. So interests, which classical thought saw as inherently corrupting to public virtue, started to be seen, or at least debated, as potentially positive forces, legitimate factors in public life.
You see that debate explicitly.
Oh, yeah. The sources mention William Finley, a more populist politician, openly attacking the wealthy Robert Morris for his airs of superior classical disinterestedness, basically calling him out for pretending to be above self-interest when he clearly wasn't. The nature of legitimate political motivation was being actively contested.
And this questioning of old ideals, this rise of interests, it must have challenged the traditional social hierarchy too.
Fundamentally, the sources argue that as different factions of the gentry competed for power and influence, especially during the imperial crisis, they increasingly courted the people. They started using all this Whig rhetoric about liberty and rights to win popular support.
But that backfired, or had unintended consequences.
It definitely aroused a level of popular political participation and expectation that, once unleashed, the gentry found they couldn't easily suppress or control. It started to transform the very basis of governance, moving it away from the old systems of personal connection, kinship, and patronage, what the sources call the breakdown of family interests.
And new voices emerged, people challenging the elite.
Yes. You see figures like the anti-federalists, people like Melancton Smith or William Petrikin, who weren't just suspicious of centralized government power. They were explicitly challenging the traditional idea that only the wealthy, educated, disinterested elite were fit to lead. They saw society differently.
How so?
Not as a unified, homogeneous whole, and certainly not as a neat hierarchy with everyone in their proper sphere. They saw society as more pluralistic, diverse, made up of competing interests. A far more modern view, really.
How did these clashing views play out in actual government structures, like the Articles of Confederation or the Constitution?
Well, the article saw fierce debates reflecting these tensions. For example, how to calculate each state's contribution to federal expenses. Should it be based on population or land value? Land-rich states like Virginia liked population. Smaller states with high land values, like in New England, hated that. They fought over Western land claims, too. And even the Fugitive Slave Clause sparked debate, seen by some as violating state sovereignty.
And the Constitution. Was it seen as resolving these tensions?
Initially, its inauguration was met with a wave of optimism, a sense of consensus, greatly helped by Washington's unifying presence as the universally respected leader. But the underlying tensions didn't just disappear.
Madison seemed aware of them.
Deeply aware. His view of legislation, interestingly, was almost like judicial determinations. He worried constantly that in a republic, legislators representing specific interests would inevitably become judges in their own cases.
So he hoped the actual judiciary
Could step in as a kind of disinterested and dispassionate umpire.
Okay.
There's that classical ideal, again, to mediate between conflicting interests and protect minority rights, a huge burden to place on the courts.
The sources also mentioned some left positive outcomes of this shift towards popular politics.
Yes, what they term the strange and perverse consequences of democracy. They point out that in some northern states, like Pennsylvania and New York, the period after the revolution actually saw black men lose the right to vote they might have previously held.
Why would that happen?
A disturbing mix of factors, it seems. Partly, rising white fears about racial equality as revolutionary ideals spread, but also, depressingly, the cynical calculations of competitive party politics. If one party thought black voters were likely to support their opponents, they might move to disenfranchise them simply to gain electoral advantage.
Politics trumping principles.
And in a bizarre twist, the sources note some states actually granted voting rights to unnaturalized white male immigrants before they extended them to native-born black American men. Political expediency could create some very strange hierarchies.
Yet, despite these internal divisions and complex politics, the revolutionary generation is also portrayed as quite outward-looking.
Surprisingly cosmopolitan, yes. The sources push back against the idea that they were solely obsessed with America's unique destiny or inherently isolationist. Figures like the historian David Ramsey or the poet Joel Barlow explicitly saw themselves as citizens of the world.
I aim to.
Thomas Paine especially. He's quoted describing Americans as inherently cosmopolitan, overcoming narrow local prejudices. He saw people from different nations in America becoming fellow countrymen, viewing purely local distinctions as, in his words, too limited for continental minds. It's a different image than we sometimes get.
Finally, the sources circle back to the motivations of the founders themselves. What drove them, ultimately?
Beyond specific interests or ideals, the sources highlight the powerful drive for fame, what they call the ruling passion of the noblest minds. The desire for historical reputation, for glory.
Especially Washington.
Washington is presented as almost consumed by concern for his reputation, his legacy, his constant lifelong preoccupation with appearing disinterested, with ensuring his actions were seen as free from any taint of personal gain, bias, or undue influence. The sources argue this wasn't just posturing, it was a core driving motivation for him.
So, bringing this all together, after this deep dive into these incredibly detailed sources, what's the big takeaway about the American Revolution?
I think the biggest takeaway is that it was just far messier, way more contested, and frankly, more fundamentally radical and transformative than the neat, tidy story we often tell ourselves.
Definitely not simple.
Not at all. We've seen how deeply embedded those economic roots were, land speculation, the immense complexities and contradictions around the slave trade. These weren't side issues, they were critical catalysts right alongside the political ideals.
And the military side wasn't just flags and heroes. It was logistics, terrain, disease, tough choices under pressure.
Constant improvisation. And the crucial, often marginalized roles played by native nations fighting for their own sovereignty and enslaved people seeking their own freedom within that larger chaos. Their struggles deeply shaped the conflict.
Plus, there's profound internal divisions. Not just Tory versus Whig, but class conflicts, like the Loudoun County tenants, shifting loyalties based on local issues, and just the sheer difficulty of holding an army and eventually a nation together with such a diverse, often resistant populace.
And finally, tracing that evolution in political thought. That fascinating shift from the classical ideals of virtue and disinterestedness, ideals that were already under strain towards a grudging, contested, but ultimately growing acceptance of self-interest and pluralism in public life. driven by economic changes, yes, but also by powerful new Enlightenment ideas about equality and human nature. The ideas themselves weren't static. They were being forged and reforged in the heat of the struggle.
So this academic perspective, using these sources like a map, it really reveals the revolution not as some inevitable unified march towards destiny.
No, more like a chaotic collision, a collision of diverse economic interests, deep social upheavals, desperate military improvisations, and profoundly changing political ideals, all shaped by the very real, often surprising motivations and practical challenges faced by the actual people living through it.
It gives us a much richer, I think, and more nuanced foundation for understanding where the nation actually came from. It shows just how tightly woven together the economic realities, the social structures, and the political ideas really were in making something entirely new.
Well said.
So, maybe a final thought to leave everyone with. Just consider how many of those fundamental tensions we've unearthed in these sources. That constant friction between pursuing the public good versus private interest. That struggle between high-minded ideals and messy, often brutal economic realities. The perennial push and pull between centralized power and local concerns, local identities.
They haven't exactly gone away, have they?
Not at all. The specific context, the players, the issues, they've all changed dramatically, of course. But you have to wonder how much those underlying questions, the ones wrestled with so intensely during the revolution's complex birth, are still shaping our debates, our challenges, our society right now, today. Something to think about.
Definitely something to think about. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into these really fascinating sources.